This is Politics Unscripted, the segment of the show, the debate uncensored. For 4 days this week, South Africans watched as 4 of the country's top judges were grilled on their suitability for the Constitutional Court position, basically to become Chief Justice. In a first for the country, President Cyril Ramaphosa called for public nominations of the judges following the retirement of former Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng. Then yesterday, the Judicial Service Commission officially recommended the Supreme Court of Appeal President, Justice Mandisa as the next Chief Justice of South Africa. Now, during these interviews, there were questions on transformation, diversity on the bench, which brings us to this particular question. Can the appointment of a Chief Justice be apolitical? Freedom Under Law Chairperson, Justice Johann Kriegler is part of this panel. Research and Advocacy Officer Zikhona Ndlebe is part of this discussion as well, including Newzroom Afrika contributor Dianne Hawker, who watched the process unfold throughout the week. To all of you, thank you so much for making the time for this important discussion. Can I begin this discussion with this particular question? And it has to do with the official recommendation of Justice Mandisa for the position of Chief Justice. We're going to talk about the process which led to her being recommended. But first, can we talk about her vision and mission for the judiciary? Justice Kriegler, do you believe that hers was the winner above all other candidates?
Frankly, I would prefer not to express any opinion on the ranking of the horses in the race. That's for the president to decide, and I think I would rather leave it to my colleagues if they wish to express a preference for one or other of the horses.
That's a cautious approach. Let's come to you, Zikhona. What are your thoughts? How did she perform?
Well, I would definitely agree with Justice Kriegler. We can't rank the candidates. That is up to the president, and perhaps it would have been up to the JSC as well to decide which candidate came first and which candidate came last during the interviews. Yeah. But with Justice Mandisa vision for the judiciary, I think she did raise important issues that exist within the judiciary, and she did try to state the solutions that she has for those issues. One of the issues that I think is important is the fact that there is no sexual harassment policy, there is no maternity leave policy for judges, and it's as if judges do not get pregnant, as she said during the interview. So that's an important issue. And then there's the issue of transformation that still needs to take place in the judiciary. And she mentioned that, and the other candidates also mentioned that. And she also mentioned the fact that courts need to go online, which is something that she has implemented at the Supreme Court of Appeal. And again, other candidates mentioned that as well. So that is why it's a bit tricky to rank the candidates, because they are all of high quality and they are judges, judge presidents, they are sitting in the Constitutional Court and the presidents of the Supreme Court of Appeal. So they're all qualified, they're all competent for the position. So ranking them will definitely be up to the president, and perhaps that was also up to the JSC, and the JSC has already done that, but we're not aware of the process that the JSC has followed.
All right. Dianne Hawker, your thoughts on the vision and mission of Justice Mandisa for the judiciary?
Good afternoon, Polly. I think it is difficult, as the other panelists have said, to rank the different visions, because I think all the candidates really focused on different things. But I think what did stand out from Justice was that before she actually presented her vision, she spoke about her existing achievements. And I think that was something that definitely stood out in terms of what was presented. She started out by saying that previously, when she came to the Judicial Service Commission for the position of Supreme Court of Appeal Judge President, she had given certain undertakings of things that she would want to improve there, and then went through those improvements and what she had achieved. And I think that is definitely something. I mean, I saw some of the commissioners nodding their heads, remembering her coming forward at that stage, mentioning some of those things. And I think another standout thing is what Zikhona mentioned, regarding the sort of policies available for judges. Granted, it was something that was touched on by different candidates when they spoke about remuneration and other issues. But I think that some of the issues that she raised about the sexual harassment policy or the lack thereof were quite different from what was raised by the other candidates. There was an overall, I think, understanding that there is a need for the judiciary to modernize. And on the modernization question, I would say Justice Mlambo definitely came with more detail on that front. And then when you looked at Justices Madlanga and Justice Raymond Zondo, they came more with a sort of a constitutional court institutional memory perspective that the others who haven't been at the constitutional court were not able to bring to that discussion. So definitely different points, but she definitely had some standout issues that she raised.
Justice Kriegler, let's come back to you. With the history and knowledge of the judicial process you have, has any president in South Africa's democratic history ever ignored the recommendation of the JSC with regards to a Chief Justice? And if he chooses to ignore this one, can he avoid explaining his reasoning publicly?
I am unaware of any president in the past not accepting the recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission. But you must be very careful. The Constitution requires the President to consult inter alia the Judicial Service Commission. It does not require the President to ask for its opinion as to ranking. He merely has to consult them. And in that respect, the present instance differs from any previous one. This is the first time where the President has put forward multiple names and asked the JSC to express its views.
Yeah.
He did not, as far as I can understand, ask them to rank them, but presumably they understood their job to be to rank them. I thought he just put the names forward, but I'm not familiar with the details there.
Zikhona, let's come to you. Let's deal now with the contentious matters. The Helen Suzman Foundation's Nicole Fritz in the Sunday Times today says, while many will applaud Justice Meyer's recommendation because of the history that is being made in the country, if indeed she does become the country's Chief Justice, but this will be as a result or out of a result of a, quote, a tainted, irrational, degraded process, which is no victory at all. Do you concur with Nicole's observations?
Well, let me first say that the mandate given to the JSC by the President, as Justice Kriegler has said, it was for the JSC to advise the President. It was just a consultation. And the JSC has gone and made a recommendation, as we saw yesterday. But during the week, when we spoke to the JSC spokesperson and asked about what would happen on Saturday, we were told that the President has given the JSC a mandate to interview, which is basically a consultation, as I've said. And the JSC would not make an announcement on Saturday on the decision or which candidate has been recommended or which candidate the JSC thinks should become the next Chief Justice, because the JSC should first report to the President, because the mandate from the President was for the JSC to consult and give a report back. However, we have seen that something totally different from what we were told transpired yesterday. So whether the process is tainted or not, I do not wish to comment on that specifically, but what needs clarification is the mandate that was given to the JSC in terms of its work in this whole process, because it's a very important process. And perhaps the JSC understood the process differently from other people's understanding. And again, we need to note that the JSC still needs to give a report to the president. The recommendation is not enough. The JSC needs to report to the president on the candidates that it interviewed as far as we are concerned, and state everything that it found for each specific candidate. And whether the recommendation of Justice Mandisa Maya is the correct process or not. At this point, we need to first see what reporting the JSC gives to the president.
Dianne Hawker, you were there the entire week. You've observed how this whole process unfolded. The Helen Suzman Foundation is now saying that it is talking to other NGOs with a view to mounting a legal challenge against the process. These are people who've litigated against the JSC before. Your thoughts around the entire process and whether this possible legal challenge could reverse the outcome here?
Well, Koli, I think that, the Judicial Service Commission very recently had a bit of a blemish on its name by the fact that it had to redo the Constitutional Court interviews that were conducted early last year. And I did think that perhaps it would take that into consideration before this round of interviews took place. It had said at the time that they were hoping to have some kind of workshop for the commissioners to give them a sense of how things should unfold. But I think part of the problem, Koli, is that if you look at the different candidates and the issues that were focused on in the different interviews, they vary significantly. And one has to wonder whether that actually helped the public understand this process. And of course, while the JSC does have its own mandate from the Constitution, it is still a public process that people are watching to also try and get an understanding of how they have come to their conclusion. And so if you look at Justice Mandisa Maya's interview, for example, while she was asked some questions about leadership and what she would do in terms of changing the bench, there was a heavy focus on gender and also issues around gender. While that's not important, the question is, was that overly emphasized in that interview? If you look at the interview, for example, of Judge Mlambo, there was a focus for about 2 or more hours on this sexual harassment rumor that was then decided that it should not actually form part of the record. And one wonders that if that was not brought up at that stage, what else the JSC would have spent so much time discussing with this candidate. And I think that will be one of the issues that can really be challenged, because in the past, the JSC has not disallowed things that are not formally presented, and it had also disallowed things that the candidate didn't have prior warning of, which in this case, Judge Mlambo also didn't have. So there definitely is a problem with consistency of interview processes with the JSC. And I think until it resolves that issue, it's going to continue getting challenged in the legal process over and over again every time that there's a high-profile interview process.
Yeah, and it goes without saying, Dianne Hawker, that the sexual harassment rumor, quote unquote, was expunged by the chair of that process. Justice Kriegler, let's come to you. Your thoughts around...
Can I first say something before I answer your question?
Sure.
I want to endorse what has been said about the process. The process, I watched for 90% of it the whole week. I was appalled at the standard of many of the questions. I was appalled at many a time the chair allowing people to go on indefinitely in what was really waffling. The general standard of the debate was not at all what the public is entitled to expect of the Judicial Service Commission.
True. And can I ask whether the Helen Suzman Foundation, when it says it's talking to other NGOs, are you one of those that they're talking to with a view to mounting this legal challenge?
We are one of the NGOs. As far as I don't know what others are, we have been in touch with one another, yes.
Sure. All right. When we return, we are going to continue the discussion here because I've got another question for Justice Kriegler, and that is got to do with the chair of this particular commission, or the JSC. How did he fare? Because I had a conversation with someone who was quite confident that he was going to run a very, very clean process, and I wonder whether those views will be shared by my panel here. We'll continue in a moment. We're watching the debate uncensored, and we're discussing the JSC interviews that were conducted recently, all for the position of Chief Justice, the 4 candidates interviewed, and quite a contentious process, as you have heard throughout the start of this discussion. Justice Kriegler, let me quickly come back to you before I move on to Zikhona and Dianne Hawker. The interviews as they progressed throughout the week. I had a conversation with Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, who was confident in the abilities of the chair of these interviews, that's Justice Xola Pete. In your view, do you think that Justice Pete fared well in leading a process that was legitimate?
I regret to say the answer is no, and I would like to say as little as possible about it. But the fact of the matter is that each of the candidates was subjected to what was not a questioning, but was actually very close to an interrogation, to a process of questioning to exhaustion, and that is not in the interests of the Judicial Service Commission. It's not in the interests of its objective. The chair should have controlled the meeting much more closely and should have contained members to a much stricter time schedule than was the case. I understand the difficulties of the job. I understand that there are headstrong and powerful persons on the Judicial Service Commission. It is for the chair to exercise the authority that the Constitution vests in him or her to see to it that the proceedings of the Judicial Service Commission are carried on in an orderly, proper fashion, and not to get out of hand, and certainly not to allow people with a political motive to ambush candidates with unsubstantiated but highly damaging rumors.
Let's come to you, Zikhona, and let me ask the question around the participation of politicians and this process almost becoming entirely political. Has this always been the case? In fact, why is it necessary that politicians participate in the JSC?
Thank you, colleague, for that question. So if you look at the composition of the JSC, there are around 8 commissioners that are politicians that come from the ANC, and then there are around 3 or 4 commissioners that come from different political parties other than the ANC. So the politicians in the JSC are around 10 or 11, but I stand to be correct, but it's around that number. And the JSC is comprised of around 27 commissioners. So politicians are almost half of the JSC's composition. But now, what we saw firstly is something similar that happened in April 2021, where questions were out of line and commissioners were allowed to ask irrelevant questions, political questions. For example, if you look at the question relating to Mr. Arthur Fraser that was asked to one of the candidates, and that is Acting Chief Justice Zondo. That question, a lot of time was spent on that question, and it was an irrelevant question for the JSC interviews. Perhaps it could have been asked once or twice, but after the candidate had answered that question, the chair was supposed to step in and say, that is enough. The candidate has answered the question and he has absolutely nothing else to say. So it's not only that question, but there are other questions that are of a political nature. But if we look at the interviews holistically, there were other questions that were irrelevant that did not only come from politicians, but came from the commissioners that are appointed by the president. And those questions were also out of line. So yes, the questioning is politicized to a certain extent, but it does not come from only politicians, as we have seen. So that's a problem. And what we've been saying as Judges Matter is that first, the JSC needs to have a criteria as to the line of questions that it asks candidates. And if a candidate is being interviewed for a high position such as a Chief Justice, the questions have to be pointed at the position that the candidate is being interviewed for. And most importantly, the JSC needs to also have guidelines as to how it conducts itself during interviews. What role does the chairperson play? Because the chairperson allowed unnecessary questions being posed on candidates. And the chairperson at the end of the interviews read out a letter that from what we saw, was not supposed to be read out in public. Perhaps it should have been because of transparency, perhaps not, but there was a lot of confusion around that. Yeah. And then we saw that Judge President Mlambo was sitting on the candidate's seat this time around, but what he was aware of in terms of adverse comments being raised was totally different from what the other commissioners were aware of. So there's that discrepancy. The JSC needs to have guidelines. It needs to have a set criteria that it's going to stick to during interviews.
Dianne Hawker, there are those who hold the view that the participation of politicians is sometimes helpful. And why do I say that? Someone points to the complaint from Commissioner Malema, for example, against the current Minister of Justice, Ronald Lamola, who was accused of trying to push for Judge President Dunstan Mlambo to act at the Concord, this allegedly to help him prepare for the role of Chief Justice. And when Justice Zondo is asked about this, he says, well, this was an anomaly. It's never happened before that I, as a Chief Justice, would get such an approach from the minister, even though the law, as the minister eventually quoted from, did seem to allow for it. Why was it important that this anomaly is discussed?
Well, Toli, I think that, the Constitution, let me first say that the Constitution most likely did imagine that the appointment process for judges, and in particular senior judges, would have some political aspect to it. Otherwise, it would not have set out the numbers, and the numbers are very clearly set out in, I think it's section 178 of the Constitution. But I think that it tried to create a counterbalance by making sure that the person who chairs the JSC is always the most senior judge who is available at any given time. So if the Chief Justice is not available, then it should be the Deputy Chief Justice. If the Deputy Chief Justice is not available, then it should be the Supreme Court of Appeal President or the Deputy Supreme Court of Appeal President. And I believe that that is meant to create some sort of balance. And I think that does go back to your question about whether a Judge Zikhona did a good job. I mean, I towards the end of the proceedings, it did seem like he was a bit overwhelmed. And one of the commissioners had to actually say, Chair, take control of your meeting. That's not the kind of comment that you want to hear coming from a commissioner in a meeting process like this. When you speak to the issue of that letter, of course, that is something that is important for South Africans to know. And I don't think that, there's any view that politicians should not be allowed to ask questions. But there does need to be, I think, and this is what Judges Matter is pointing to, some sort of guidelines. I mean, if you think of any ordinary job interview, there's usually a job description of some sort, and the Constitution doesn't give much of a job description. It just says the Chief Justice should be someone who is fit and proper and who's a South African. The JSC needs to go into the detail of what they are looking for in that fit and proper and spell it out to the nation, so that not only are we able to hold the judge that they eventually recommend accountable, but we can also hold the JSC accountable to say, actually, did you look for someone who was fit and proper based on your very own criteria?
Yeah.
And right now we have none of that to be able to go back to. And it leaves them open to attack about the rationality of their own process.
Justice Kriegler, right at the start of these interviews, your organization, Freedom Under Law, came out to say 2 commissioners should not participate in this process. Name those commissioners for us and give us your reasons for those who missed it.
Tolly, we were prophetic in that objection. We objected to Messrs. Malema and Mpofu participating. We objected because both of them had been found to have breached ethical rules of their particular professions. Mr. Malema by the Parliamentary Ethics Committee, Advocate Mpofu by the Legal Practice Council's Disciplinary Committee. People who are under a cloud as to their ethics have no business sitting in judgment on others. But it's not only that. You saw, or anybody who watched the proceedings, saw who the people were who caused the gross injustice to one of the candidates by raising a totally unsubstantiated rumor which inevitably left a smear, and they knew it. Of course politicians can participate. They must participate, but they are also bound by all the ordinary rules of ethics and decency.
Let's come to you, Zikhona, talking about matters that came up during this heavily politicized interview process. Something else that was quite striking for me was clearly what was being made an issue by Commissioner Malema, and that is the number of times that Justice Zondo met senior ANC politicians, including the sitting president. Why do you think this came out strongly as some kind of criterion through which to assess these judges?
Holly, it's a fact that judges are there to, apply the law. Their position is within the judiciary. And then we've got the executive, the legislature, which in the executive we've got our politicians. So if you're a judge, as we heard Justice Mandisa Maya say that when she was questioned on her integrity and ethics, that if she had a neighbor at some point who was a politician, and whenever she saw that neighbor, she looked the other way, she walked the other way, because she did not want there to seem to be any relations between her and a politician, because she is a judge. And that is how it's supposed to be. That is exactly how it's supposed to be. Judges have no business meeting with politicians. And we know that people in the legal fraternity know politicians, but there needs to be a line that is drawn. And that is in terms of Judges' Code of Conduct. And as you've seen with Justice Mogoeng's involvement in political controversy, it does become a problem when a judge wants to involve themselves in political issues, and when a judge specifically wants to meet up with politicians. That is unacceptable because there are lines in between.
Dianne Hawker, quickly, I have to take a break. Zikhona makes a very interesting point here, which made me, in a way, put my foot in it in the socials about this whole process. When she says judges have no business meeting politicians, and so it came up that Judge Zondo met with the former President Jacob Zuma. In fact, at the time, Jacob Zuma had just been made president of the ANC, and this approach was private, and he says he acted as a member of a concerned citizen, to put it bluntly. And Mr. Malema is making an issue of this to say, you involved yourself in political matters. Why did you do that? Did any new information, by the way, come out, Dianne, about the so-called relationship between Acting Chief Justice Zondo and former President Zuma?
I think the thing that was new information for me, at least, was the contents of that discussion. These points were touched on when the former president challenged Justice Zondo chairing the State Capture Commission and calling him biased towards him. The contents of the one discussion relating to Commissioner Malema's comments or statements that he would kill for Zuma several years ago, that was definitely new information to me. And that led to him obviously saying that Justice Zondo was getting involved in political controversy. I think it does put Justice Zondo in a bit of a difficult position. I mean, he says that he was operating from the perspective of being an ordinary citizen. But to be honest, I don't think that judges are often able to operate as ordinary citizens. And certainly in terms of their code of conduct, there is actually a requirement from them to almost be treated in a different way. I mean, when we saw the complaint against the former Chief Justice Mogoeng, he invoked, rights of freedom of speech and freedom of association. And the response from the Judicial Conduct Committee is, while you do have those freedoms, they don't apply in the same way to a judge as they do to ordinary citizens, simply because judges would have to comment and sometimes rule on controversial issues. Yeah. And that is why there needs to be that distance that's created. So I think Commissioner Malema did say that one of the issues that he would raise in the deliberations was that he felt that Justice Zondo was too close to the political process. And I suppose we'll have to see whether there's any fallout as a result of that, whether there are any complaints that come to the Judicial Service Commission over what has now become apparent based on that discussion.
Well, Dianne Hawker talks about potential fallout. I have a bit of a tricky question for Justice Kriegler, but we'll do that after the break. You're watching Politics Unscripted. We are reflecting on the interviews for the position of Chief Justice that took place this week, and some calling it quite a controversial process indeed. Let's come to you, Justice Kriegler. And I want to use Dianne Hawker's words when she says whether there's going to be fallout as a result of what took place, in particular around Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo's words in relation to these visits that he made to former President Zuma. We know that there is a pending case, the recusal application. It is still before the courts. The revelations that came, Dianne Hawker talks about the content of the discussions between Zuma and Zondo. Might that compromise Justice Zondo in this ongoing case?
Only the short answer is no, certainly no. The long answer is the interaction between Judge Zondo and Mr. Zuma, former President Zuma, is an old, settled debate, years old, raised right at the beginning of the commission, when the commission first sought to compel Mr. Zuma to come and give an account of his conduct. It's been settled. Mr. Zuma's allegations were denied by Judge Zondo. He said that as far as he was concerned, the conduct between them and the interaction was normal and there was nothing wrong with it. That has been settled. I know of no new information that can at all disturb what is long dead and buried.
Zikhona, let's come to you. If indeed this process is challenged successfully, I read in the Sunday Times KSEC stating that there really wouldn't be a need to rerun the whole process. How do you see things unfolding? In fact, perhaps the start should be whether the president is going to simply forge ahead and confirm Justice Mandisa.
To answer your first question, Ali, the president might just go ahead and appoint Justice Mandisa. It's really his prerogative. As to when he does that, or we don't know. We don't know. But it is quite unfortunate, I have to say, that we have been without a permanent Chief Justice for over 100 days now. And the appointment of a Chief Justice should have been underway way before the end of last year, but that did not happen. And you've asked a second question as to what is going to happen if the interview is challenged, the interview process is challenged successfully. It would be unfortunate to have to see the candidates be on the hot seat again and be interviewed by the JSC. And the unfortunate part of it would be the fact that this has happened before. It happened with the April interviews. And although the October interviews were much better than the April interviews, the same outcome was reached by the JSC to recommend the same candidates for appointment to the Constitutional Court. And perhaps that is what might happen if the interviews were to be rerun again for the Chief Justice position. And it goes back to the same issue that we've had with the JSC, which is that it does need reform. It does need to have a criteria. It does need to have a set of guidelines as to how it conducts its work. Because if there isn't any of that, the same problem is going to keep arising until the JSC knows exactly what it is doing and how it should be doing it, which is making sure that we've got a good quality of judges.
Yeah. Dianne Hawker, final thoughts from you. How do you see things unfolding from here on?
Well, we heard, Xoli, from JSC's members that there is going to be some sort of workshop again after these hearings, but hopefully before the upcoming Constitutional Court interviews, which are meant to take place in April. So I would hope that the JSC does use this time for some reflection and does take into consideration that the Constitution does enable it to make its own rules and to make its own processes. That's actually enshrined in the Constitution. So to be able to make rules and make processes and make those rules and processes public would, I think, empower the JSC and give the impression, a better impression of its work than it currently has. I think a lot of members of the public looked at that process and how some of the questions were phrased and posed. For example, the questions posed to Justice Maya and other candidates about whether South Africa is ready for a woman Chief Justice just didn't make sense in the context of the job that they were applying for. And those are the kind of things that the JSC should reflect on in the next couple of weeks so that they do better the next time around.
Justice Kriegler, your thoughts very briefly. If it were for freedom under law, how would you want things to unfold from here on?
I would support heartily the suggestion that the Judicial Service Commission conducts a heart-searching workshop and sets itself once again clear rules, clear criteria that they look for, clear rules of internal debate and conduct, and a reinforcement of the chair's power and duty to control the proceedings.
Justice Johann Kriegler leads the organization Freedom Under Law. Zikhona Ndlebe is with the organization. It is called Judges Matter. And Dianne Hawker, Newzroom Afrika contributor. Thank you all so much for a very fruitful discussion.